Hello, and welcome back to Oceanography 106 Lab. I hope you enjoyed last week's lab and are feeling confident about unit conversions. These unit conversions will be revisited several times throughout the semester, so if you struggled with these concepts, please reach out. Today, we will be going over plate tectonics. The first concept that we will be going over is the concept of continental drift. It was first proposed in 1912 by scientist Alfred Wegener, who noticed that continents seemed to move and drift relative to each other. At first, his ideas were rejected due to the lack of a plausible mechanism for this happening. The concept of continental drift, however, reaches far further back than the early 1900s. In the late 1500s, scientists started to notice that continents seemed to fit together like a puzzle. You can see in this picture how it looks like the tip of Africa matches up with the edge of North America, and geological rock assemblages match up across continents. You could find two halves of the same rock formations on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. The only way this could occur is if the continents were together at the time of formation and then moved apart. There are some species that are shown to have lived millions of years ago and appear in the fossil record on continents now separated by an ocean. The example shown is an aquatic reptile with fossils found on South America and Africa. However, it is unlikely to have been able to traverse the entire Atlantic Ocean as it exists today. The theory of continental drift was affirmed in 1968 with the theory of plate tectonics. This theory describes 7 large, rigid plates that move in a lateral motion from side to side on a viscous substrate. A viscous substance is one that is able to flow, and viscosity is a measure of resistance to flow. Something that is highly viscous flows very slowly. Viscosity is dependent on the temperature of the substance and the chemical composition. This concept offers an explanation of how continents move with respect to one another. Movements of the continents and the spreading of the seafloor are a direct result of large-scale movement of tectonic plates. This is a very important slide to remember. The lithosphere is defined as being the outer shell of the Earth. It is very rigid and hard, whereas the asthenosphere exists below the lithosphere, and it is plastic, highly viscous, and is able to move. It is very, very hot molten rock. It may help to visualize by thinking of how the skin forms on the top of hot chocolate over time. As it cools, a thin layer of whitish skin forms on the top of the beverage, and if you stir it, the skin will go back into the liquid. Similarly, the rocks that make up the lithosphere will return to the asthenosphere when they are subducted. The experiment that we will go over this week's lab relates to convection cells. This is a very important concept to remember. Have you ever noticed how when you climb stairs in the summer, at the bottom the air feels cool and comfortable, but as you reach the top, it gets progressively warmer? This is the same concept as convection cells, where warm air, or in this case, warm molten magma, will rise and cooler magma descends into the asthenosphere. Convection is defined as the vertical transfer of heat by the circulation of a gas or liquid, in this case a plastic solid. This is an idealized representation of plate tectonics and seafloor spreading. The mantle is a molten layer of rock under Earth's surface. Under the crust is a gradient of heat, similar to the staircase analogy. It is hotter near the core and cooler near the crust. Warmer magma is less dense and therefore rises relative to the material around it. A circulation cell develops where heat rises from the base of the asthenosphere, travels along the bottom of the lithosphere, and cools as it moves. The asthenospheric material increases in density as it cools and becomes denser than the material around it, resulting in sinking of the material. It then gets rewarmed when it descends enough to get closer to the core. This process is continuous as the ocean floor is constantly moving. There are three types of plate boundaries. We have spreading centers, subduction zones, and transform faults. The first are spreading centers, or diverging plates. These are plates that are moving apart from each other where new crust is created. The separation of the plates allows some of the material from the asthenosphere to rise, and eventually become new seafloor as it cools. We also have subduction zones, or converging plate boundaries. This is where plates are coming together. One of those plates is subducted beneath the other, resulting in lithosphere returning to the asthenosphere and being recycled. Finally, we have transform faults, which are boundaries where the plates are moving laterally past each other. There is no creation or destruction of crust, but there can be surface earthquakes as these plates rub as they move. This diagram details all of the different types of plate boundaries. See if you can identify which one is which, and then we will go over it together. At the very center of this picture, you'll see a divergent plate boundary. This is an area where the plates are moving apart from each other, and a asthenosphere is able to rise to the surface. Toward the edges, you'll see convergent plate boundaries, where the oceanic plate is being subducted or pushed under the continental plate. In this case, the rock is being returned to the asthenosphere and will be recycled. Along both plate boundaries, you can see small perpendicular offsets. These are transform faults. They help to alleviate the stress of the movement of the plates. The age of the seafloor is a bit difficult to determine because it varies significantly. The youngest seafloor is found at spreading centers, which are areas where new seafloor is created. Remember, these are diverging plate boundaries where the seafloor is spread apart and new seafloor is deposited. These are often called ridges, such as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, but rises are also spreading centers. As you move away from a ridge or a rise, the seafloor becomes older the farther you go. Subduction zones are where seafloor is returned to the asthenosphere, often resulting in a deep trench such as the Puerto Rico Trench. This diagram shows the age of the seafloor throughout the world's oceans. Red indicates the youngest seafloor, and blue areas are the oldest. Looking specifically at the Atlantic Ocean, you can see the younger seafloor along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and the oldest in the Atlantic Ocean basin is close to the shore. As the Atlantic Ocean has continued to spread, the older seafloor is the farthest point from the ridge. With that said, even as the oldest points in the seafloor are only about 180 million years old. With that said, even at the oldest parts, the seafloor is only about 180 million years old. Do you remember how old the Earth is? Around 4.5 billion years. Why then is the seafloor so comparatively young? Looking at the ages around the Pacific Ocean basin, they are much younger, especially where there are subduction zones. The oldest seafloor is typically subducted back into the asthenosphere. This cycle repeats itself every 200 million years or so. While the Atlantic Ocean is spreading and becoming larger, the Pacific Ocean is dominated by subduction zones and is slowly getting smaller. For this week's lab exercise, you will need to calculate the spreading rate of the seafloor. We will be using this equation. Velocity equals distance over time. This is an equation you will use throughout the course in different ways. It would benefit you to remember it. The velocity is the total spreading rate of both plates. It is important to remember that since the plates are spreading apart, each is responsible for half the total movement. For example, say you and your friend want to socially distance from 6 feet apart. If both of you walk 6 feet apart, you will actually be 12 feet apart. If you both walk 3 feet, or half the total distance, then you will be a total of 6 feet apart. See the following equation. The problem gives a distance and a time. Simply divide the distance over the time to find the velocity. For this assignment, the units centimeters per year are the most appropriate, so remember to convert the units into cm rather than km. This week, there will be a portion that requires the use of Google Earth. We have posted a separate tutorial for that portion, so be sure to check that out for instructions. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Good luck!